Welcome to Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Todd Shaw. Dr. Shaw is the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. He researches and teaches in the areas of African American politics, U.S. racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, public policy, and citizen activism. His first book is entitled Now is the Time, Detroit Black Politics and Grassroots Activism. His current book project, under contract with Oxford University Press, is entitled Black Places of Empowerment, the 21st Century Communities of Black Politics. He is also a professional DJ and father of two. Let me bring in my brother. Brother, it's been a long time.
Yes, it has. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Okay.
It's good to see you. Good to see you.
Good to see you, good sir. Other than the gray under our chin, black don't crack.
That's right. That's right.
It's a real pleasure to
Oh
be with you
man.
in your audience today.
So we're going to talk about this election, but
Okay.
I want us to take our time getting to it, right? Some necessary background. But I
Okay.
always begin, Helen's a psychologist.
Yes.
And even before my relationship with her, going
Hmm.
back 30 years, I was a big fan of Bill Cross's work,
I see.
Negrescence theory.
Right.
So, what I want to do in the beginning, and I want you to do something that's probably more difficult for a preacher and a professor than anybody else. I want you to be succinct but comprehensive.
Okay.
Okay. So,
That's a
uh,
challenge, but I will.
you should know that I try and this is a conversation. So it's
Great.
not strictly an interview; it's a conversation. So I
Great.
interrupt. I'll push you on some points, possibly.
Great.
So what I want to do now is tell us who you are.
Hmm.
I want to know about the social historical context in which you spent your formative years. I want to
Hmm.
know the place
Hmm.
where you grew up and your class background, and
Hmm.
specifically what kinds of events, incidents, activities, readings, films, process, whatever it was that led you to become a professor of African American politics,
Hmm.
U.S. racial and ethnic politics, public policy, social activism. How did
Hmm.
you become this progressive scholar that you are?
Well, again, it is great to join you this evening and great to see you after all these years. So I guess I would describe myself as a black man whose experiences have been shaped in part by a nurturing black community and some parental and grandmother wit.
Mm,
Um, Born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, a Hoosier. Raised in a Black Methodist church, a Black United Methodist church, which is different from the denominations
the
of
AME
the AME church,
and
yes, EME
AMEZ.
church.
Yes, yes,
That's
yes.
right. That's right. Um, and then just very quickly would go on to Howard University, and that was quite a formative to my experience, and that's really where I became a Black political scientist, or got the fervor to become a Black political scientist, and then schooled at earned my PhD, master's at University of Michigan. Um, so in the context of that community, I'll start with what sparked my thinking with regards to politics. I remember being 9 years old. It was
Hmm.
August of
Okay, what
1970.
year? What year?
It's August of 1974.
Okay.
Richard Nixon was getting on the plane after he had a helicopter after he had resigned, and I said to my mother, "Mommy, why does the president have to leave the White House?" ever since that time, I have been unpacking the question of political accountability in a nation that argues it is democratic, although the historical legacy and some of the empirical evidence would suggest otherwise.
That's right.
And so then I can also recall in my church that my father was very I would say in some ways, Brother Sundiata, that my father was very much a man who was steeped in the Black community, was very involved in the African American community. In some ways, you could say my father was a recipient and not so subtle advocate of Black capitalism because he was a Black businessman. Okay. And in this way, my upbringing was very much a middle class upbringing. But my father kind of touted a sort of view that was expansive. And this stems from his faith and also his own Black consciousness about Black business development and the empowerment of Black communities in this Black business development. He was a vice president of the first minority-owned Black bank in Indianapolis. Okay. And then I become to understand, of course, that Indianapolis is the city of Madam C.J. Walker. She would put her headquarters. And so I began to understand this notion of Black empowerment through Black economic development. I actually wrote a paper when I was at Howard University around that question, pulling actually from some work from the Journal of Black Political Economy.
Oh, yeah. They had some great articles in the 72, 75, 76 period critiquing Black capitalism.
Oh, yeah. And critiquing, right. Very much critiquing. And I developed my critique of capitalism at Howard University. But I began to understand, taking various courses there, I began to understand this question of how, African Americans in various ways have reinterpreted aspects of Western and Western systems and Western political thought in various dimensions. And I'll be succinct and stop it for there for right now. So then I also recall in my formative years, so my father being very involved in the Black community, very concerned about Black business development, really about Black economic power in the community. Even though my father wouldn't have called himself a Black power advocate, but I remember that he had these episodes, he would have these magazines of certainly, mother and father, Ebony, Jet, all these images in our houses of Black empowerment. And he would talk to me from time to time about politics. In fact, I also recall that at our church, at the end of certain meetings in the church, as is Barn United Methodist, we would have members of the city council who are African American would come by and say, "We're not part of the worship service, but we want to talk to you about what's going on in the community." And I'd always be intrigued to say, "Dad, can we stay afterwards and see what the councilman has to say?" So sort of both that question of what's economic empowerment in Black communities, my formative years in Indianapolis, born in '65 and growing up in the '70s and '80s, and then going off to Howard University, all those things kind of helped to shape who I am and how I characterize myself as a scholar of African American politics. And it was some of those formative experiences that really mattered in that regard.
Well, thank you. Were there any particular readings or films, classes that pushed you? I mean, if you grew up in a home in which the ethic was Black development through capitalist economics, right? Now, your father's right. That was one of the four streams of Black power. Right. There was certainly a Black capitalist stream of Black power, right?
It was.
Todd McKissick and others.
That's right.
People want to downplay it and speak as if Black power was simply a radical ideology or proto-ideology, but no, it was more complex and had a light side. How's that?
To be sure.
Alexa, stop. Alexa, stop. Turn off. Henry, can you unplug it or something?
Wow, these devices, huh?
The technology, ain't
oh my, it's watching us.
Ain't it something?
Okay.
So classes, books, film,
Right.
things that helped you sharpen
Right.
the development of your philosophy?
When I was 18 years old, I was hopping on the bus and I opened a book that blew my mind and to this day is still formative in my thinking. That's the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that book, in some ways, the one thing that I still take from and admire about El Haj Malik Shabazz is his, of course, his courage, but his fierce determination and commitment to truth, no matter the cost. And for me, I sort of puzzled about that in my mind, and then I thought about it, and I try to live that ethic myself. Is that at some point in life we are called to speak to what we see as power and to truth, and will be cost, or there may be cost. And so, but in all the ways in his formative years, what he worked through, and his and the evolution of his life is what always made him a hero to me. Is that Malcolm didn't stop in a place; he kept going. And if Malcolm hadn't been assassinated, we know he would have kept going. And so to me, that evolution, I mean, similar to Du Bois, I'm teaching a course now on Black political thought, and I said, Du Bois took a trajectory that we typically don't take as human beings. He got more radical as he got older.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And so, and they're like, oh, more radical? Yes, more radical. Du Bois ended up, our voice, was well into his 90s as a Pan-African communist in Ghana.
That's right. That's
right. So that, but to get back to your point, that book, again, in many ways, it was sort of the moral lessons of Malcolm's life, as well as the political lessons of his life, that had me really it really kind of made me fundamentally think about what it requires to be committed to notions of Black freedom. And so, so that I would say that book was the book that sparked my consciousness.
What's amazing here is that Malcolm's autobiography, despite all the current critiques, right, is probably the most transformative book outside of major religious books for individuals. But in terms of secular story,
that's right,
across generations of Black folk, right?
Right.
Certainly my generation and the generation just before me, and not only you, but even today's students, when they're exposed to Malcolm's autobiography, they talk about how meaningful, right? To be honest with you, I only know two books that get that impact: the autobiography of Malcolm X and Asata.
Okay. Yes.
Get a similar kind of piece, right?
Right.
So anything other than Malcolm?
So yeah, I mean, I think as I went into my years at Howard University, certainly Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks, and some of it was, again, the sense of how to, to me, it was the eloquence of Du Bois. I said, Du Bois would go on later to critique himself and disagree with himself. But where he started, he was always plain spoken about what he saw as a challenge. And he always had a eloquent way to summarize what he saw as the problems of the race, right? And in powerful, sort of sonorous language. And I was sort of always impressed by that aspect of his life, even though folk critique, well, Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, where did it really derive from? And in some ways was Du Bois talked about the double consciousness of the middle class. I mean, there's all those critiques,
absolutely.
Right? Right.
But what I just want to jump in here because
sure.
I've always been intrigued by the fact that most people who talk about souls, they focus on the Booker T. Washington and others.
Right.
They focus on our cultural strivings,
yes.
right? Where he talks about double consciousness and and the color line. But the heart of the book is the middle chapters where he's dealing with the Black rural proletariat.
Right.
and he's
Okay.
describing the life of the black majority,
Mm-hmm.
and where a lot of people only saw docility, he saw militancy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I always found it odd that people ignore the heart of the book, those four chapters in the middle.
Yeah, I think that to your point, Brother Sundiata, you could link souls then on one part of the Boyce's sort of intellectual his intellectual development or his developing ideas to Black Reconstruction on the other end, right? And
Hmm.
sort of if you can link those notions because it's very explicit by that book of the
That's right.
1930s.
That's right.
He's
That's
like,
right.
well, let me plainly speak. I mean, because in some ways you could say, well, how did Du Bois get from what Dawson might call radical egalitarian or some
Hmm.
aspects of Black conservatism and uplift ideology and respectability politics? How did he move from there to be to be intrigued at least by aspects of socialism and then later Marxism?
Right.
And so I agree with you that that's an astute observation to say, okay, but he had this respect for the fundamental insurgency of the Black working class, of the Black proletariat. Yeah, yeah, and of course, Du Bois was making these observations about
That's right.
and not and again, I think his address. Trying to think, it was to the it was it the sort of like, I forget, it was the 40th or 50th anniversary of the Boule, but where Du Bois kind of lays out the striving
I think
90th.
it's the 50th. Yes. Yes.
50th
Yes.
of the
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it says
Yes.
the striving 90th, and so Du Bois
Yeah.
clearly
Yeah.
took the later view about that proletariat and say, nah, that talent's intense. Okay, whatever. But let's think about
Yeah.
let's make the
Yeah.
real measure the 90th percent.
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. Undoubtedly.
Mm-hmm.
Just another minute on Du Bois.
Sure.
I'm always struck, and you get this a lot with students that, and it fits in with this political moment that
Mm-hmm.
people read Du Bois as an elitist, and they read Booker T as a man of the people. When in fact, well, yeah, Booker T was enslaved, but Du Bois grew up very, very poor,
Okay.
and people
Right.
seem to miss that.
Right.
And he was comfortable with impoverished black people, rural and urban,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because you don't spend your summers in college going to the rural parts of
Right.
Tennessee to
Well,
teach
this is true.
every
This is
every
true.
summer and living in the huts and the shacks
Right.
with folk during
Right.
that.
Right.
And you don't get all those people in Philadelphia to spend 30 minutes, 3 hours
Right. Right.
doing interviews if you aren't able to communicate to ordinary black people with genuineness.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
Well, and maybe that, I mean, you make an excellent point, brother. Maybe it's folks confuse Du Bois's professorial manner for his character and heart, or where really
yes,
his consciousness was, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because of course Du Bois, you know, he's portrayed in these photographs and dressed in a way that portrayed a certain dignity that he
that's right.
wanted to convey on behalf of the race. But folk might can say, well, that's professorial and elite, rather than that was simply his manner to say, it similar to the Brothers of the Nation of Islam. We're going to project a certain image
That's
so
right.
that that we respect ourselves.
There you
Mhm,
go. There you
mhm.
go. What they now deride as respectability politics.
We have
So
all types of funds in these circles. uh,
so politics, you get the bug at 9.
mhm,
Um, but how do you develop that interest in both mainstream electoral politics?
mhm,
Well, maybe even I should probably say insurgent black politic in the mainstream, but
mhm,
also social activism,
mhm,
protest politics, movement politics.
mhm,
At what point do you? I know today you would describe yourself as a fusionist, and I want you
mhm,
to unpack that
mhm,
for the audience. But at what point do you begin to see
mhm.
the relationship between those two things? Because certainly that's not what you get out of school. I know you got the community connection with your
Right.
father, but how do you develop that fusionist view?
So there are a couple of influences that impact me at Howard University, and one of the great first and greatest is my mentor Ronald Walters. So in some ways, Walters was my Du Bois because he brought together this sense of he's like, well, I took a course Southern African politics with Ronald Walters. I took a course entitled Malcolm and Martin with Ronald
Mm,
Walters. And I may have taken a third course. I may have taken African American political thought writ large with Walters. Um, but to me, what impressed me about him is that he he was it's essentially my first example of the scholar activist, right?
okay.
In the sense that Walters was there at the Gary Black Power Convention.
Hmm.
He was making comment about how we have to be relevant to the community, and even that concept of being relevant was one I learned from him and others at Howard. What does it mean to be a relevant scholar? I'm like, well, what does that mean? And so that notion of relevance. Um, then likewise, that sense about how do you make your and so also my interest in electoral politics comes from the fact that Walters and others. Let me also give due credit to Professor Joe McCormick and Linda Williams, who was also
Okay. Yes.
pivotal,
Yes.
very
Yes.
pivotal in my thinking. That they all were kind of trying to unpack the black political condition and what role. And they never said to me at any point in any of these courses, black politics. I can remember distinctly taking my black politics course. Black politics, electoral politics is not the sum of black politics. Every one of them would say that. They say black politics and black political power is broader than what folks do in relation to the state.
Hmm.
And so I was always said, okay, that's my politics is the exertion of political power in many respects. And so that means you have to have something other than going into the voting booth every 4 or 2 years. There
Right.
must be obviously some ways in which the community thinks about and holds its leaders accountable in between those times. And then my admiration for Malcolm, my admiration for civil rights and black power leaders says, well, clearly some of them, I know Leonard Moore and others write about how the ways in which the black power movement was pivotal in the election of black elected officials, let's be real.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was clearly, again, these black power activists, grassroots activists from various movements within the Black liberation movement, who were on quote unquote the outside of City Hall, outside the Howard halls of government, but were fundamentally making those grassroots connections to militate for change. So I would say that's one of the ways in which I really kind of got intrigued about this whole question of electoral politics and why it still fascinates me today, even though I have always defined it in my work is black politics and black political power is always broader than who we elect. It has to be.
Right. Has to be.
Right. Uh-huh.
So, probably the most difficult question for us as a people
Mm-hmm.
is determining theoretically what is our relationship to the United States, to this
Mm-hmm.
white ethno
Mm-hmm.
state. And maybe
Right.
that's too sharp and not nuanced enough.
Okay.
There is a smattering of some residual of a moments of gestures toward multiracial democracy.
Right.
Right, right.
Right.
But in the main, how would you describe our fundamental relationship? Is there a political concept that you could use? I know that for some reason, and I honestly can't fathom it, but
Okay.
caste as an explanation for the black condition in the
Uh-huh.
United States is back in some currency. In
Uh-huh.
fact, uh, President Joe Biden
Mm-hmm.
uttered that term a couple of weeks ago,
Hmm.
and it seems to have caught on with the black political class and their white liberal colleagues, and even some radicals. I think
Hmm.
in the Jacobin, they've started to use the term caste, which I'm baffled by
Okay.
as a as someone who appreciates Oliver Cox.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So,
Uh-huh.
so
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Hmm. Well, so I would argue, so there, quite frankly, brother, I at times struggle with that question myself, even though I study it. And but one way I would argue, one empirical approach to that um, vital question is this question of, or the way that, for instance, Smith and King talk about notions of racial order in the African American condition.
Hmm.
And,
Now, for my
so,
audience, you need to give us some full names and mention the text
okay.
because we got a very smart audience. They're gonna go read it if
Okay,
you
okay, all
give them
right,
the
all right.
reference.
All right, all right, all right. So, and in fact, I need to, let's see. So look up the. I'm not going to give the title correctly because I don't have it right in front of me. But look up the. Um, it's by Desmond King and Roger Smith. You could go on the site Google Scholar, Desmond King and Roger Smith, and look up. Simply put in the term racial order, and it'll be. You'll find it intriguing. It's out of the American Political Science Review. Um, and actually, some of what they say is also reinforcing some things I read in Michael Dawson's, actually in several of his books. One is Black Visions. Well, actually, Black Visions is probably parallels that closely in what he's saying in those initial chapters. But so Michael Dawson, Black Visions is also in terms of Black political ideology. But the reason why I think racial orders is intriguing to me is this: it's sort of this idea that um, at no point in time is the American state, the American political economy, rooted in the full inclusion of African Americans, and that in a really fundamental sense, that what gains, and this is why I study. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. And this is why I study sort of social movements and grassroots movement. It's always about the ways in which African Americans, Black people in the United States, people of African descent in the United States have militated and fundamentally sort of brought about some degree of social change by version of what the state had to concede. The old Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without demand. And so in that article, King and Smith talk about, there are ways in which the American state arrives at certain political equilibriums, but it also is a political equilibrium that doesn't move very far. I mean, we're still dealing with the contradictions of the anti-democratic U.S. Constitution.
Hmm.
Let's be real. The U.S. Constitution, and I've just come to this conclusion, from the Electoral College to the fact that the right to vote is guaranteed by state governments, not by the federal government itself,
Right.
by all the ways in which the Constitution had to be amended. Frederick Douglass, eloquently tried to argue about the Constitution was not
Yeah.
a slavery document, but I think
Brother
Fred
got
knew
that
it
one
was.
wrong.
Yeah, Fred got that wrong. Yeah, Fred was powerful, but he got that one wrong. It was, and it had to be the 14th Amendment that would begin to bring about some degree of transformation. So, in some ways, I think the argument that they make is that we have to always be mindful of what equilibrium has been struck at this time for the sake of for the sake of political stability in the state.
Hmm.
And that balance swings between some notions of egalitarianness and white supremacy, leaning more often toward white supremacy at key
That's right.
moments, including white nationalism at the present moment.
Hmm.
So that's one sort of. And I say this because myself, Robert Brown, and Joseph McCormick, one of my beloved mentors at Howard, we edited a volume entitled "After Obama: African American Politics in the Post-Obama Era," and we said basically, listen, Fred Harris is right. Obama became the president. the first African American person to self-identify as African American of the American Empire. So how do you explain, and so in some ways you can explain Trump relative following after Obama because of those contradictions that are unresolved, because it was the racial order leans more toward Black exclusion than inclusion. So that's at least one broad swath of a theory that I think is fairly powerful in explaining where we are.
Yeah, I would add class exploitation.
Absolutely.
Because when this place began, I mean, only the landed could vote, right?
Right.
And for quite a long time, that was the nature.
Right. For the longest, folk have made a critique of Charles Beard's an economic interpretation of the Constitution, but I was always intrigued by Beard's view. It's like, well, wait a minute, why is contract sacrosanct? Why? Because the Constitution supports a capitalist, political economy, of course.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
And a racist capitalist economy.
So, this is the electoral season. It's still ongoing.
Yes, sir.
And I just want to run some data that you're very familiar with. In 1964, there were only about 104 Black people elected to public office, from dog catcher to president, just 104 in the entire country.
Right.
After the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, you very quickly see it rise to about 1,500 folk by 1967, 3,500 by 1975, and over 10,000 today. There are 59 Black congresspersons in the 117th Congress. I guess we will soon have in January the 118th. But 59 Black folks in the House, and 2 in the Senate. But that 59 in the House represents 13.5% of House members, which is near parity with the 14% Black population, right? But only 2% in the House. Okay. Yet, if we take a broader view, the more than 10,000 Black elected officials are about 1% of all elected officials in the United States. So coming back to your question, and you've kind of touched on it previously, but is electoral politics worth the time, energy, and resources that we commit to it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because, and I will say this, because of course, we have to fundamentally ask the question about the African American community, the Black community, having the fundamental right to the resources that it gives to the economy and to the government by way of, we are taxpayers, we are citizens. But I think first and foremost, you don't have a democratic or even the sort of broad sort of reference to a democratic society if you don't have the right to the franchise of the vote. and that vote, I mean, your audience knows how hard fought that vote, the right to that vote is. And I think,
well, actually, some folks in my audience are questioning it.
Okay, that's good.
You're giving Booker T's, you're giving Du Bois's response to Booker about the vote, right?
right. Which I agree in this respect. I mean, and actually, the irony is that Washington also, as you know, Washington also had some. Washington didn't have the public view on some of these things, but privately he was arguing for. And that was Washington's politics. We know what he thought he could, the power he could amass by playing one end against the other. But no, I think the notion of being a citizen, being rooted in that right to the franchise, the right to the vote is fundamental. And I don't blame folk for in any way, shape, or form arguing and still investing enormous energy in it. And I'll tell you why. It is not that I think we as Black folk are pragmatic folk. I think we have some level of expectation and hope that things will change, but we are mindful of how long it has taken, in the larger view. And there are ways in which it can matter. I mean, I think that there are times in which I've studied, for instance, I'll tell you one individual who I thought was at least intriguing, was the first African mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
The fact that Washington, and his approach to the campaign made me fundamentally respect the notion of a grassroots approach to electoral mobilization in politics. The Washington asked for a plebiscite within the community, or there was a plebiscite, I should say.
Right.
Let me be
Before
clear.
he would run, yeah, absolutely.
And so to me, there are these sort of freedom or emancipatory possibilities, even though they come up against the hard truths of the political system in which we exist. And certainly aspects, if we go back, I mean, I'm in South Carolina. I came to South Carolina because I was intrigued by the fact that South Carolina elected more African Americans to public office than any other state of the former Confederacy. And the individuals like Robert Smalls, who had a vision of what Black freedom would look like in a multiracial democracy. And so I think that I understand that why, in fact, folks have and continue to invest so much work in that vote. Now, the problem is, again, and this is why I study grassroots activism, who is to hold those in power accountable? And this is actually essentially what I try to say in my Detroit book, is sort of, in what ways do grassroots activists attempt to use protest and effective means to make those in power accountable to Black working class communities, to the Black proletariat? And so, and that's a tough fight, and they did not always win. They would, in some cases, they would concede that it was a drop in the bucket what they were able to do.
Well,
but then they left
when Adolph Reed, and actually, I try not to agree with Adolph Reed, but I do agree with him in this regard, that those Black regimes, for the most part, did deliver for the middle class, for the professional managerial sector, the emerging entrepreneurs.
Yes.
But the masses got fairly little, particularly after the first wave, right?
Right.
The Harold Washingtons, maybe the first term of brother in Detroit, Coleman Young.
Coleman Young, right. You're right. And I think, and of course, it's the irony is that generation was the closest to the civil rights and Black Power movements, right? So the further we got away from those mass movements, in some ways, the ways in which that those regimes set in, incumbency set in, and so did, and you also, and Reed makes the point powerfully, it's like, and Black demobilization set in. Well, I have a Black mayor, this in Atlanta, I'm gonna elect the sixth Black mayor since 1973. Hooray. So when I've been displaced from, by the Olympic Stadium construction, right? And my family is dispersed by virtue of what's happening with public housing and subsidized housing. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying that communities have said in terms of their righteous cynicism. So, I would say that the investment still matters, but the potential of grassroots activism and the need for those agents within community who are well known, within those that coming together, that networking, those coalition politics outside of the halls of government are still fundamental to really empowerment and accountability and responsibility happening within government.
So, what happened Tuesday, man? It's Tuesday. Where did we make advances, hold our position, or lose ground? And I'm saying this in the context that nationally, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus,
Mm-hmm.
um, with the exception of the ones who are also in the Progressive Caucus, I
Mm-hmm.
think very little of them, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that they move the needle in the interest of the black majority at all. They
No.
do deliver for the entrepreneurial, professional, managerial
Mm-hmm.
sector.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but even taking that in, where do we stand now as a people with this thrust toward fascism?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, they ran 81 black Republicans for
Right.
statewide and national office
Right.
here in Champaign. I don't know if you remember the Amons, Aaron
Mm.
Amons, Carol Amons,
Mm. Yes. Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
in Champaign, Carol is the state representative, a radical black socialist woman.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, we have him as the county clerk.
Okay.
We've been fairly successful in that arena, and
Right.
yet our people still are ranked seventh on the 20th worst cities for black people to live, right?
Right.
And we've been fairly successful. But the Republicans, they take a backward Negro out of if you can believe it or not, a sundown town.
Right.
The lone black person in the sundown town, Tolono,
I can't believe it. Yes.
and run him against our radical brother.
Okay.
Okay, now we defeat this Negro,
Right.
but the point is that that was their national strategy,
Right.
and in some places they were successful, right?
Right. Right.
So where do we stand at this moment after this election?
Mm-hmm. Um, we haven't gotten we won't have a full accounting probably until about a month from now. I would say that we're at a point that I wouldn't say that we should celebrate and say fascism has been turned back. It has not. In fact, it's interesting to me that that Congressman Clyburn got some heat
Okay.
because he called it out as he felt he had to see it. Um, but but it
Wait a
but
minute,
in but in
Clyburn called it out.
Clyburn called it out. He says, I'm a student of history, and I this we are tending toward Nazism, as he called it.
Oh,
He did,
okay,
and
okay.
he got some flack for saying it, but he
Yeah.
said, you know.
I got to pull him out of the deep hole on the white side of the fence and nudge him a little closer to our side.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I think he said that in the sense of, the broader threat as opposed to the threat relative to,
To
the unraveling of the equilibrium, if you will, of the
okay.
American political state versus sort of what might be true for black folk, although I'm sure he had that in mind as well. Um, but I would say, my brother, just to answer your question directly, um, I think we're in a bit of peril. And that peril is that the, the depth of the threat can't be turned back by the degree. The system still has these contradictions that will persist and will bowl toward those who are on the fascist side, quite frankly. We still have, and I know that that's like a sort of a global answer to what's happening in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have, let's not fool ourselves to think that as we'll talk about in a moment, the Supreme Court
Mm-hmm.
with its arch conservative majority that is going to be daunted even by the election results in terms of what it will turn back. That the Republicans still hold sway and dominance in the deep South, of which 52% of black people we live,
Mm-hmm.
including myself. I mean, the governor's race here in South Carolina, they talk about Florida, but the governor's race here in South Carolina was as gaping a wide, gap between the Democrat and Republicans. So any pretense of political party competition, even under sort of liberal and neoliberal notions, doesn't exist really. And we know all the threats haven't gone away. They haven't passed legislation to guarantee the vote. They haven't passed legislation in Georgia to even permit people to take water in the line, let alone all the other practices. So all of that law still stands. And we have Supreme Courts and federal courts that appear to reinforce it. So we're not out of the woods. We might have a breathing moment to say, well, the Republicans might proceed a little more lightly. They might get a smarter Trump in DeSantis.
Yeah.
But they're still going to have Trump and Trumpism and the white nationalism and all the anti-democratic, small d things that result. So we as a folk are still in a very precarious moment. There's just a little breathing room. It's not the Democrats for which African Americans vote for did not suffer enormous losses, and so the political narrative is that the Republicans will be chastened. I don't think they will be, and then the downside you and I can both recognize is that, and this was true for the tragedy with Obama. It's sort of like, Black folk are saying, okay, among these two major political parties, okay, we're going with the one we think most proximate to our policy interest.
Right.
Whether we agree with it or not, it's most proximate to our policy interest. But then that also creates a tension of, I can't hold the same party accountable when it is doing, when it is in the pockets of X or Y, when it is supporting less than, whatever it's doing in terms of its foreign policy, whatever it's not talking about in terms of meeting real Black policy needs within various communities. So it creates this tension of, we can't quite criticize the Democrats because we know how horrible the Republicans are. And so we're not out of the woods in terms of that predicament. So we're at a moment of pause for right now, but I'm not convinced that 2024. I'm trying to be, have an earned hope relative to what is actually positive developments, and I'm not absolutely certain we're out of the woods. We're not.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the level of precarity went up.
Okay.
It didn't go to the top of the mountain, but
yes,
it rose.
I see what you mean. Right. Right.
It rose.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Within the context of not just Black electoral politics, but within the overall movement as well. But certainly there is a narrative that seems to be growing, that there is a political and perhaps ideological split between Black men and Black women. And as the argument goes, women are engaged and progressive. Men are disengaged, and a much more significant sector of them are leaning to the right.
Okay.
How do you respond to that?
Well, feel free to cast a critique relative to Democratic Party politics, but of course, I would question the sanity of folk who would vote for Herschel Walker. But I mean, there's just so many things there.
Yes, so many things.
so many things. Now, it ain't just about ideological conservatism. No. But actually, Brother Fred Harris at Columbia, he and I were having a conversation, and he alerted me to something that I thought I already knew, but I went back and looked at this data. There's actually been this ideological split between Black men and women, or let me cast it in this way, of African American men voting a little more Republican than Black women has been true since 1972. You can map that across these decades, that there's been always this little bit of a split. And
has it ever been greater than 5%? Because it's about 5% now.
It's about 5% now. Although, you know what? there are times in which folks will say, "Oh no, it was 13%." It was. Some have said it was 21% when you look at Stacey Abrams and the Brian Kemp race in Georgia. Now, here's the problem: is that what data are they using, right? And I just want to tell your audience, read exit polls when you get them from the New York Times. As good as they are on some level, read exit polls carefully, because they don't have large enough samples unless they make
a black folk,
a black folk, of Latinos, of Latinx folks, of people of color.
Right.
So you've got to oversample for these populations to actually get what voters mean when they leave the voting booth. So we got to kind of look at them and be careful as to what we can draw from them based on those sample issues. But yeah, I've heard as high as 21%. The one figure was that Stacey Abrams got 91% of black women's vote in Georgia and 81% of black men.
Yeah.
So, but back to your point. So I do think that this is a function of a not so subtle ideological divide between black women and men. And I think it has something to do with the ways in which black women engage in politics and lead politics within communities, and think about policy issues. We also see this divide around certain policy issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually part of the book I'm writing, is entitled "The Communities of Black Politics." To say, folks say that black people aren't a monolith. Well, how does that complexity of the black condition with these various identities bring folk together? How do you achieve black unity? If that diversity actually exists. And so I try and work through that.
Let me press you on a couple of points here.
Sure.
Because I understand you were making a general point, but I want you to get specific, right?
Sure.
In terms of that divide, that gender-based divide, now, to what extent is there a group of black men who don't vote because they take a position that this racist capitalist system, and they may not frame it that way,
right,
but that they don't expect change unless this system is grabbed by the throat and pinned to the ground? Is there a more radical, or at least a more militant side to black male politics? And I'm not going to suggest that that's the majority, but it has to be a slice of that group. And then I've heard some people say that they supported Trump because they want the stuff to go straight toward fascism, so we had no choice but to fight. Now, I think that's some stupid, but I have heard that.
Okay, I understand.
So,
I think an aspect of this disengagement, it clearly can be African American men who are politically alienated in various respects, right? And so, and it has to do with the ways in which, racism and economic exploitation are gendered, right? And all the ways in which,
you're gonna have to unpack that for folk.
Okay, all right. I will unpack it in this way.
Okay.
So we're seeing, it is not the case that, questions of police brutality, questions of police murdering African Americans are only black, it happens only to black men, right? But there are perceptions and gender perceptions that police have in their heads when they draw those guns, right? About the threat of black men and the perception of black men and black men's masculinity. I mean, in some ways, for instance, the fact that social psychologists and others can tell us that, the perceptions of young black men, really black children overall, but young black men are perceived to be older than they are, right?
Older and larger. Older and larger,
right? Yeah, that they are not, youths of 12 years old, but they're 14, 15, 16. They know better, and they were actually, Tamir was actually pulling the gun. So these perceptions work in ways that oppress African American men and women, but their differences are ways that gender, as combined with racism or with economic exploitation, is a different filter by virtue of what gender does, right? About all the presumptions we have about what does it mean to be a man versus be a woman in this broader society. So, in that way, I think that we can say that the particular alienation these men may have is one where they say, okay, let's just think of the cumulative effects of things that, we are seeing the rates of incarceration of Black women skyrocket, or they have been.
Oh, a couple of statistics here.
Right.
Black men make up something like 40% of all men who are incarcerated.
They
And
do.
black women make up 52% of all women who are
That's right.
incarcerated,
Right.
right?
Right. 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 So and those so and that development, as I understand it, Brother Sundiata, um, has occurred over this period of the mass incarceration as we understand it
Yes.
today from the late 1970s forward, right? Now we know it's rooted in sort of the the Jim Crow sort of racial sort of racial regime of Southern law and law enforcement. We know all these things, in the way in which is, as Malcolm said, up south, the whole nation
Right,
has,
right.
has this racial regime in various ways. But I
We-
say
We're
that
gonna come back to that because we got some crazy stuff happening on that concept. But
oh
go
yeah,
ahead.
okay. But so again, I'm just sort of putting forward the argument that race and economic exploitation can be gendered, and that gender can visit itself in certain ways for Black men and Black women that may lead to disengagement with participation in differing ways. The ways in which Black women may see other community institutions as a means to have viable participation, in ways that some Black men, that segment you're talking about,
Hmm.
may not. So that's things we could unpack further, but that's just sort of some of my suspicions in response to your question.
No, I think that you clearly is, are describing real phenomena, and that it is that material base that explains it, and that people seem not to grasp that just because the response to the system is different on the basis of gender, and that gender manifests itself differently in terms of race and class exploitation,
Hmm.
doesn't mean that the impacts are equivalent,
Right,
right?
right,
Right.
right, right.
Violence, physical violence, is going to be used more against black men. You know,
Hmm.
it's a coincidence, but it is interesting to note that 96% of all lynch victims, of
Hmm.
all black lynch victims, were men,
Hmm.
and 96% of all police killings of black folk are men,
Right,
right?
right, right,
Because that type of violence is generally reserved for black men.
right,
Other
right,
forms of structural violence,
right,
right, are reserved for black women.
right, right. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you use that up south thing, Malcolm's quote that everything south of the Canadian border is
Right.
south.
It's up.
Well, a group of mainly white scholars, but also some younger black scholars have gotten onto this notion. Well, actually, also a couple older black scholars like Charles Payne got
Okay.
onto this notion, and they make the argument that there is no fundamental difference between the North and South,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I think that that's the most asinine comment I've ever heard,
Okay.
and that is so fundamentally disrespectful to black folk because
Hmm.
7 million black folk came
Right.
north,
That's right, for a reason.
and I don't think my grandparents were out of their minds.
Right,
I
right, right,
think that
right.
they clearly understood their fundamental relationship to the political economy
Oh
and
yeah,
privatized violence.
that's right.
Um, and the notion of a different opportunity structure in the North,
Hmm.
though still deeply racially discriminatory and
Right.
exploitive,
Right.
but different,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. If you're talking about the context of folk, well, from Chicago to Mississippi to
Yeah, yeah,
Chicago,
yeah.
or in the case of Detroit, from Alabama to Detroit. Yeah. Yeah. You were in the context of Jim Crow segregation in Alabama, of all the attendant ways in which your dignity, your personhood, your ability to work, all of those things were framed by these racial strictures and these strict racial strictures. There's no doubt about it. But then, you, but you had the wherewithal to move to the black bottom of Detroit, Michigan,
Yeah,
and to say, okay, at least I see now. We know urban renewal
yeah,
destroyed
yeah,
that community, but I
yeah.
see black communities. I see elements of black freedom. I see actually, by the 1950s, the election of African Americans, even before the Civil Rights Movement, the election
Mhm.
of African Americans like Charles Dix and folks before him to the state legislature and into Congress. So you're right. It's like folk weren't out of their minds to think that moving to Chicago, moving to Detroit, moving to New York made sense given the racial and economic violence of the South, in all these ways. So yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
but it's also that sense of why this sort of larger ways in which black folk have had this this complex relationship with the South. Why have folks moved, had this reverse migration to the South? Why am I coming back to South? Why am I coming to South Carolina?
Yeah, yeah,
Why
yeah,
am I
yeah.
leaving Illinois and Indiana to come to South Carolina? And so it's also that sense of the way in which the South, um, all the contradictions that it has, is also that fundamental place that you can't understand Black history without knowing the South. It's impossible.
No, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. But
Hmm.
but see, I think that the fundamental problem we have is that people don't want to think complexly, and so it's like that notion in some of our in large sections of our community that we're still slaves, or
Hmm.
people who are incarcerated are slaves.
Hmm.
It's a failure to comprehend the totality of what being enslaved meant.
Right.
Right, being
Right.
enslaved wasn't. I mean, it was the main function of it was labor exploitation, but it
Right.
wasn't just labor exploitation.
No,
Right,
no,
right.
far beyond
I mean,
that. That's called indentured servitude.
they could pass on, they could take you. Thomas Jefferson, that famous quote
Right.
that they used to keep out of books by him, where he said that the best investment is a black child born every 2 years.
Hmm.
Okay, that's not the situation we in today,
No,
right?
no, right,
And the differences between South and North, you can see it in every quality of life indicator, from income,
right,
right, to
right.
education. I grew up in a community in which at least minimum half of the black folk were born in one county in Tennessee, Haywood County.
Right.
Haywood County
Hmm.
was the prime cotton producing county in Tennessee from the period of enslavement to into the 1960s.
Okay.
And the black folks who fled there, I was fifth, sixth grade. You get a kid come up from Brownsville, Tennessee. They're
Hmm.
the same age as you, 10. They
Hmm.
don't come into the fifth grade class.
Hmm.
They put them in third grade or fourth grade,
Okay.
right? Because they didn't go to school 9 months of the year. They went to school 4 or 5 months of the year because they had to pick cotton.
Okay.
Those are
Right.
fundamental differences
That they are.
that
They are.
manifest itself. And for the people who want to wish those things away, it's really detrimental to us theoretically and practically in terms of building a movement that fully comprehends the nature of this beast in which we reside. But we could do this all day, my brother.
Yeah, if we
I, I,
can. We can.
I
We
want to
can.
come back and pick up we had kind of mentioned the political ramifications, but let's take it to the Supreme Court.
Hmm.
Now, we
Hmm.
know that they got that case on affirmative action. Now, affirmative action been on life support for since what,
Yep.
78, since the Bakke decision?
At least since the Bakken decision in some
Yeah.
regards, yes.
Yeah, it only stood on its own 2 feet for about what, 15 years?
About, yeah. And then you certainly had and then particularly by the late 90s into the early 2000s with the University of Michigan cases,
Yeah, the Grutter.
the
But there were
Grutter
two
cases,
cases,
yes.
right? The University of Michigan.
Right.
Yeah. So it's been on life support, and your boy, Chief Justice John Roberts, who they are now speaking of as a moderate. Wow, this guy has for decades sought to abolish the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
He has.
Yeah.
And
So
the Shelby v. Holder case
the
with the
Civil
Voting
Rights,
Rights
the
Act,
Voting Rights Act, they
right?
they they
Sections
neutered
4,
it.
6, 5.
It's it's
Right.
it's it's neutered.
Yes.
So my question to you is this: we know affirmative action is gone. The remnants of it are gone in the spring, probably April, when they
Mm-hmm.
reach their decision.
Mm-hmm.
Voting Rights Act is already neutered. Do you see the Civil Rights Act in 1964 being ruled unconstitutional in the foreseeable future? And I
I
say that because the libertarians are
right.
Rand Paul. Those people are
Right.
gunning for it on the question of the right to assembly
Right.
and the rights of property to determine who can enter your establishment, kind of stuff.
We'll get an in. So it could, in fact, um, be aspects of it could be struck down, and we'll get a hint of that based on this affirmative action case. I mean, how expansive the court and the majority, the the conservative majority, super majority on the court goes, and what it describes will signal to us is race. Is there any strict scrutiny that can be given to questions of racial discrimination? Are there any ways in which race is a legitimate basis for arguing for levels of inequity?
Mm-hmm.
And is there a vested interest in the state arguing that, in effect, barring individuals, even in private institutions, from or using race as a legitimate means for private institutions as well as public institutions to say, um, you cannot discriminate. If I'm saying that's a
Right,
little
right, right.
inarticulately, I think in some ways, um, I'm concerned, and I'll share that with your audience. I'm concerned because there is no stopping once you say
Mm-hmm.
that private property, the guarantees that's vested in the Constitution around the sanctity of the contract means and this is clear from the language that um, and there's many ways they could go about this, Brother Sundiata, but one way could be somewhat a reflection of the ways that Roberts put this language in the Shelby v. Holder case in Alabama,
Mm-hmm.
where effectively they struck down the pre-clearance. They did strike
Right.
down the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And so districts can, and I know your audience knows, but districts can effectively, who have been found so for years to be guilty of or in violation of the Voting Rights Act because of these practices of discriminatory voting practices, don't have to get them pre-cleared by the federal courts before they put them in place. And that's why, Texas,
All
North
the
Carolina,
ID laws and all this
that's
crazy.
right, full force. And the court's not striking down any of that. Well, Roberts said in effect, well, what if Congress chooses to update the formula it uses, then we will review that. But the problem is Congress is using a formula from 1965. So that's what we find objectionable. And that was his rationale. Well, you could
Right.
say the aspects to that of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to say Congress has to revisit these things and update them. Well, if you have a Republican, and it's cynical because you have a Republican, you may have a Republican House and maybe a Republican Senate, but maybe a thinly divided Democratic majority in the Senate. How are they going to come to agreement? There was no major voting rights legislation passed, and we know why.
That's right.
Because that would confront a logjam. So it's almost the court could lapse into simply saying it's not we're striking down the entire legitimacy of racial or of non-discrimination by race, but that we are simply saying that Congress must revisit this to bring it into the 21st century, knowing that you are not going to get a majority in both houses that is filibuster proof to ensure a passage of a new Civil Rights Act. But it could, so I'm concerned because it could be just a straight, and this is actually what Sandra Day O'Connor said in both the Michigan cases, or effectively in the Michigan cases. She says, I'm supporting affirmative action. This language could be used again for the Civil Rights Act. But at some future date in the future, we should not have to have affirmative action. And so that's probably what Thomas and Alito and others will simply latch on to say, well, Sandra Day O'Connor said in 2005 that at some future date, 25 years in the future, we probably won't need affirmative action because we won't have the levels of discrimination. Well, we know that, probably at the University of Illinois and other places, those numbers haven't changed in terms of the numbers of African American.
Actually, they've gotten worse.
They've gotten worse.
Actually, they've gotten worse.
Right.
The California system, they rooted us completely out of that system.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry that's a long answer to your question, but yes, I'm concerned. It could happen.
So I got one more question for you, and then we're going to go to the audience questions and statements. But I've been toying with this idea in terms of reparations, right? Deeply influenced by American Indians' positions around reparations, where they argue that what's needed is sovereignty, right? That should be the major goal, greater autonomy and control. Would being classified with a similar designation as the American Indian nations, would the African American nation within a nation, to borrow Dr. Martin Delaney's phrase from 1852, would we be in a better position?
Yes, but I guess how we as you know, the question of how far that parallel goes is that what does that sovereignty imply, and what is its relationship to notions of land, right? Because that's intrinsic to the Native American notions. We were here first. And we know in various ways.
DeSantis disputes that.
Who's that?
DeSantis out of Florida.
Oh yeah. Okay, all right.
He said we didn't steal any land.
Yeah. That's just critical race theory. Okay. So I think that. So yes, I think the African American condition and tradition is such that that notion of nation within a nation. In fact, you still even as late as I know there was the 1993-1994 National Black Politics Study of Dawson, where you had at least, if I'm not mistaken, well over a third of African Americans, probably, I think if I remember those numbers, like 40% of African Americans saying, no, we believe, at least symbolically, we are a nation within a nation. So it's a powerful framing of the Black condition. and when you use notions of sovereignty or autonomy more broadly, folk continue to endorse. If you again, I study some of these surveys, and there's actually excellent surveys from the last 30 years in terms of African
This is
Americans,
the
and so
National Black Political Survey that came
yes,
out of the University of Michigan.
that included, and then now there's the Collaborative Multiracial Politics Study, the CMPS, that's in 2016, 2012, 2016, now 2020, has asked some of these similar questions among a significant oversample of African Americans, at least 3,000 folks or more. And so you still have, in some ways, I would say that there have been this persistent support for notions of autonomy. There are relatively consistent support for notions of reparations. It varies widely as to what you mean by reparations, but the very question of, are African Americans morally due reparations, however you see that, relative to generations of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and the new aspects of racialization, folks say yes. But I'm not. I have to think on whether or not I do not know if we can use. There are parallels that don't quite work as well because autonomy and sovereignty are two different things. Yeah. So that's where I'd have to think on that.
What I'm intrigued by is that they get control of their policing and their education.
Right.
Now there are all other, there's a downside to being described as a domestic dependent nation, but I would argue we are a domestic dependent nation without any of the semi-sovereign benefits.
Okay. You mean Detroit's not? Anyway, no. I'll stop it
there. So all right, I'm going to go through here and start pulling commentary from the chat.
Okay.
There's one here I think it's mainly for me. But I'm going to just answer it.
Sure.
Do you think it'd be valuable to interview Steven Steinberg on this platform, particularly regarding the topic of affirmative action?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to say yes. Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to move on that.
Okay.
I'm going to move on that.
Let me know when you do that because I would like to hear.
Okay. Good. I've got somewhat of a relationship with Steinberg.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Very cool.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that essentially come down to and questions and comments that boil down to this. Aren't we a colony?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's in reference to the question about caste.
Right.
So how would you respond to that?
So I will go back to my formative years at Howard University. Some of it coming from reading, like I said, the Journal of Black Political Economy, but others of it coming from understanding, well, what does it mean to be what does settler colonialism means? What does the notion of being a internal colony mean? In fact, I can remember very distinctly from Dr. Robert Smith's argument, and it intrigued me at the time when he said it, because he says, let's make these comparisons as to what it means to be part of a colonial system. And, and particularly, and why am I blanking on, these are the vestiges of age. In describing the American ghetto as a colony.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know,
William Tabb's book.
the way into that. Right. Thank you. And actually, we read that relative also to the thinking, and this actually was also in my urban politics class. The argument of Professor Mac Jones, who's at Atlanta University, and his arguments around the internal colony situation. So I, and not even 2 weeks ago, a colleague I sat down with who's retired from Cal State Fullerton made the exact same argument. He says, I'm in my retirement, and I think I'm gonna come back to that argument about he's like, I'm 70 going closer to 80, and the argument came up in my grad training, and I think I'm gonna return back to it in my retirement to work on as a think piece for maybe a new book. I said, that's intriguing to me too. So there are all these parallels that I would agree with the premise of your caller's question, or your audience member's question, that there are some parallels between being an internal colony. Mm-hmm.
I've always been intrigued by the fact that the caste thesis has caught on at two historical moments, right?
Okay.
In the 40s, you get a whole bunch of that literature. And even though I think we would argue, at least I certainly would argue, that Oliver Cox shredded that idea
Okay.
in race, caste, and class, right?
Class. Right.
It returned recently
Okay.
in what's her name, Isabel
Wilkerson?
Wilkerson's book,
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and it's being taken up by all these policy gurus.
Okay.
I have never heard of, and I've asked from India scholars that I know, um, do you think African Americans are a caste in the United States? And none of them have ever written on it.
Okay.
Did you find that intriguing? That if the only
After all
people
this
who
time,
should know
huh?
what the hell a caste system is
Right.
like
Right.
have never thought that we were a caste.
Right. Exactly. Right.
You
Yeah.
think
And
that would end that kind of foolishness? Because I think it's a way to get around dealing with class,
okay. Right.
right?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think because what do you do in the American sense? You racialize something. You racialize all aspects of oppression, as opposed to seeing that there are dimensions, and in this case, race and class, not just race, not just class. That really is about race. It's both, and if you don't understand, if nothing else, I will also say, I don't know why I keep going back to my formative years, but being at a HBCU, I learned a little bit about class among Black folk. There is class among Black folk. Oh, I'm clear now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do hear you. Even though I knew colorism
Oh
and its
yeah.
relationship to class, it was starker
Right.
at my HBCU.
Yes. Yeah. Same here. I can remember an experience in a dorm room where both those concepts came into play, and I like colorism and class. Wow. and I was a recipient of both. And I'm like, I'm middle class, but I guess the colorism thing is what caught me.
Historically, the census takers, you could they would change your skin color, right? You could go
Right.
from being listed as black, colored, or mulatto
Right.
based on your job.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yeah. You could.
Yeah.
You could.
All right. My colleague in Black Power Media, one of the founders of Black Power Media, Jared Ball, uh, asked this question. He says, I think the only part I struggle with is that people, me included, use the 13th Amendment and the continuity of slavery to challenge the prevailing concept of some kind of freedom existing today. And he's got freedom in quotes. You
Okay.
want to respond to that?
Yeah, I've from the DuVernay's documentary of 13th to talking with some historians, um, um, Vern Burton and why am I and Defner in their race in the Supreme Court. There are these contrasting views about, well, what is the 13th Amendment, this great bulwark to freedom, or is it this is it this um, hidden, is it the justification for what would essentially become a mass incarceration system that's rooted in that exception clause, the clause that, except for in case of the punishment of a crime, involuntary servitude is unconstitutional. Well, I can understand that in some ways, Black folk, we got to use what we got to make an argument. And so to me, it's interesting that you had these many states this year passing these amendments that now will say our state constitution will no longer interpret,
that's right,
the 13th Amendment to mean that you must have involuntary servitude once you are in prison, once you're incarcerated.
right.
Now, I think the only state that didn't pass it was Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. There were 4 states that passed it. I think the state that didn't pass it was Louisiana.
Louisiana. That's right. Louisiana.
But it was a technicality in that they thought that their language was too expansive, and they needed to make it more specific.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. So, correct me if I'm misunderstanding the question, but I do think that there's a complexity to because I think both a movement around prison abolition and a movement that movement abolition can be rooted in that notion of the 13th Amendment, even given its contradiction, or that clear contradiction.
Right.
Or the argument that it is this great charter of freedom that others have argued in, like, it was never intended for that clause in effect to become what it did in terms of mass incarceration. So I can understand how activists would use it in whatever way they felt necessary to make an argument about moving things forward.
And I think that we have to realize that capitalists, as H. Brown, Jamal Alameen famously said, if you give them an inch, they'll take a yard, and they'll burn a cross on it every time. You got to factor in how they're going to exploit the situation. Big Till corrects what I would argue. Well, Big Till and Sounds of St. Elsewhere correct what I would argue. Oh, no. Sounds of St. Elsewhere corrects an argument that I know I made, and I think you might have went down that wrong road with me.
Okay.
I led you astray. And so what St. Elsewhere says is affirmative action in the way that it's used and talked about today doesn't factor in class, but there actually was a working class history to affirmative action. And certainly he's referring to things like the Philadelphia plan that Black construction workers forced on Richard Nixon.
That's right. Okay.
And that there was a degree to which working class Black folks did get some benefit out of affirmative action, particularly in the period before the mid 80s.
Right.
And it did open up some jobs. So thank you.
No, I agree.
St. Elsewhere.
I agree.
Okay, we got a minute and a half. Okay. And what I want to do is, my brother, do you have any summatory comments before we close this out?
So, I think I'll just raise this question to you and to the audience in which we're all part of here about in what ways do we move the Black freedom struggle to get forward?
Yes.
And is there a need? So I was talking in my class today about the Black Radical Congress of 1998,
Ah, yeah.
and I said, and they were also very surprised. Part of it because I said, there was a young man who was a professor at the time who attended that Congress and was in relation with brothers and sisters who were Pan Africanists, socialists, feminists, Marxists, and and he was an impressionable professor at that time, but he was intrigued, and of course that professor was me. And I'm kind of intrigued by this question we always sort of come back to in the Black political struggle about that question of assembly and coming together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Dawson raised it in his work about the notion of the Black counterpublic in the public sphere. And so how do we recreate in this post-COVID period that public sphere in such a way that we can have these critical dialogues, but also move forward in a sense of coalition, again, that is beyond electoral politics, right? And
Right.
so that's one thing I would kind of raise to all of us as to, and it doesn't have to be one grand thing, but what are the grand things that are already occurring? Because I think that's part of the problem is that, and Sekou Franklin's book, After the Rebellion, which I think is a brilliant discussion about Black youth activism, is something else I would throw out
Ooh.
there to the audience. Because
I'm,
it
I'm
really
glad to
does.
hear that. I haven't seen Sekou in 20 damn years. Well, maybe not
Sekou
that
is at
long,
it,
but
brother. He is at
yeah,
it, and he is
good,
still on the
good.
front line. He is,
Yeah.
he is. And so Sekou's book is, I think, is a excellent discussion for young people. But then there are ways we can illustrate it to all of us about be aware of that history of that coming together, of the ways in which grassroots activists have made these critical movements forward. But what should we borrow from it today, and where should we go today? Um, in broader communion with each other across these various ideological divides, but points of consensus we could reach.
Brother Todd, with that, I'm going to say that I got to bring you back in
Oh.
the new year, and we're going to have to take that up.
Okay.
I think that is a wonderful question. And so, brother, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, brother
Um,
Sundiata.
I am encouraging my colleagues to bring Todd on and let him bring some light, a black light.
What little I can share, what I little I know, I'll share.
So I'm signing off, and this has been Sundiata Cha-Jua, Real Talk History as a Weapon for Black Liberation on the Black Power Media Channel. Peace.
Peace out.